Viewers and listeners, welcome to yet another episode of The Conversation. My name is Anotida Chikumbu and I am your host. And today I'm excited to have Dr. Ushehwedu Kufakurinani, who is a social and economic historian and as well senior lecturer in the Department of History, Heritage and Knowledge Systems at the University of Zimbabwe in Harare. Today we are set to discuss his book, Elasticity in Domesticity, White Women in Rhodesian Zimbabwe. Dr. Ushehwedu, welcome to the conversation. Well, unfortunately, I cannot hear you. Can you just unmute your microphone?
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you as well.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I can hear you now. You are very much welcome. I'm the happiest man to have heard you. So how is your day going so far?
Well, so far so good. Well, it's been hectic, but I think I'm catching up.
Wonderful.
It's a nice way to end the day, with a discussion on some of your works.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm pleased to have you, and I'm pleased that you are following the discussions. So, how is the COVID-19 situation at the University of Zimbabwe in as much as teaching and learning is concerned?
So the situation is not as bad really at the institution. So we are having online classes for returning students, and then for the new students, undergraduates, we are having them for about 3 weeks here, and it's face-to-face. Then they leave the institution after 3 weeks. So, I mean, they've been trying to manage. So, at the level of the institution and even the level of the country, I think we're doing well.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's exciting. It's exciting because progress is being made, and most of these institutions have now realized that we have to live with the pandemic. We have to find ways of living with it other than what the situation was in the past. We had just massive lockdowns and there wasn't any comprehensive plan to look into how issues were going to be responded to. So today I do have a couple of questions for you with regards to the content of your book. But first and foremost, can you just describe what you consider to be your research interests and maybe just give us a brief overview of some of the articles that you have written?
So yeah, let me say, in terms of research interests, they've been very broad, very broad. Starting, I remember when I was doing my honors research, falling in love with peri-urban agriculture. I was passionate about food security. Then I remember when I was doing my master's, falling in love with, I just wanted to do something around women, gender, and so forth. And being an economic historian with a passion in social or socio-economic issues, gender seemed to be an easy entry point. That's when I can say I began to nurse interest in gender discourses and started to research on women in the public service, particularly white women. But beyond that, I've also written on monetary history, specifically the experience of Arabs had during the crisis period. I've written on migration. I've written a piece, Resettled and Yet Unsettled, on land conflict. I've written work on music. Like I love to listen to local Zim Danso, and found myself writing on music and Zim Danso, and even publishing a book, an edited book with colleagues on women, victors, victims, and villains, women and music in Zimbabwe. So it's a cross range of areas of interest, really, that I've been involved with.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. That's excellent. So right, let's talk about the book. Uh, let's talk about elasticity in domesticity. White women
Yeah.
In Rhodesian Zimbabwe. Can you just give us a brief history of the research of the book? When you started to research it, how you did the research, and possibly tell us how long it took you to complete the book and to solicit for funding or for publishers to help you to get the work done.
So the journey has not been an easy one. I must say, from day one, I told myself that I wanted to publish a book. I mean, there's something about publishing a book that is associated with leaving a legacy, an academic legacy.
Exactly.
And I think my academic upbringing was socialized into, you know, um, you know, just giving so much weight to books, and yet surprisingly, when I was now in academic, I remember colleagues, especially from Europe, telling me that it's not wise to publish a book. I mean, voices that would discourage me, especially if you are career oriented or you are planning to go for say elevation or promotion in academia. The book is not the best way to go. The best way is to come up with as many articles as possible. And then, because even here, a book is equivalent to one article, but the weight and the investment in the book. So I had colleagues, from day one also even discouraging me. But to take you back to the journey, this begins with my master's, really, on white women and the public space, which I believe I will publish as a book as well. I've been doing some digging and some more research, but that's where I got the inspiration to research on white women broadly. And then I began research as a PhD on white women broadly. And once I collected the data, once I had the information, once I had a coherent argument, I produced the PhD. And from the PhD, it was relatively easy, but I must say people must not think it's an easy switch from PhD to a book. I had to do a lot of reading of not only books, but also works that explain how you can convert a thesis into a book. So I had an option to cannibalize, if you want, my thesis into articles. And I have more articles, and therefore greater opportunities or chances of career growth or promotion in terms of career. But the book, in terms of, the idea of having a book, really, was way stronger. And so I began the search. So first was the conversion, after doing the research, then the conversion into a PhD to some chapters had to go because of the argument that I was now pursuing. The idea of elasticity and domesticity. Whereas the original PhD was talking about was just more or less a social history of white women in colonial Zimbabwe. Now I was trying to narrow my argument around domesticity and how it was an elastic ideology which could accommodate and shape and be deployed anyhow, influencing the nature and the extent of women's participation in both the labor market and outside the labor market. So that then inspired me to leave certain parts, to expand certain parts, go back to the archives, and then work around. And that took me something like 2 years, I think, after, because my PhD was in 2015. and the book was in 2019, right? So that's about 4 years of reworking the piece. Of course, there's also the year of reviews, back and forth,
Yeah.
discussions, etc. There's almost a whole year where you're doing these things. But basically, that is I would say that is the experience that I had of writing the book. And I was fortunate. At least one of my reviewers was, versed with the subject matter, at least the context, urban context, the Southern region context. So in terms of their comments, they were so thorough that I really owe them a lot, that review.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. What a profound journey. Now here we are. We now have a complete draft to discuss, a complete whole book that has been published. I'm very happy to interview you for the book, given that it's actually a latest publication, given that it's 2019, right?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, so can you give us a brief synopsis of the book and what you consider to be the central argument, if not arguments?
Okay. So first, the idea here is that societies are shaped by ideologies, right? And what it is to take us into the past and pick a specific ideology, which is domesticity, and demonstrate how this specific ideology shapes the nature and extent of women's roles and status in society. And I use white women as a case study. And the argument that I make is that domesticity as an ideology is elastic, in the sense that it can take different forms over time and space. It retains important signifiers, right? But domesticity is actually is manipulated and deployed by society. But also women negotiate and contest it. But at the end of the day, it is elastic. Now, broadly speaking, domesticity is the idea that women's place is supposed to be the home, right?
Yeah.
Or it speaks to works or opportunities that confine women to the home. It also speaks to home characteristics. So you can actually go beyond the home, but you take up occupations or issues or activities that are home oriented or that have home characteristics. And the term domesticity is coming from domestic, which also means that it speaks to issues of taming, right? Domestic animals, so to speak. Yeah. So there's the component of taming, right? So there's several characteristics here that are bundled. And I'm arguing that these characteristics or society here in gender terms, or in the gender term, society has deployed these on women, these aspects, these attributes have been deployed on women. But the deployment is fluid. That's the way the elastic aspect comes in. It's fluid, which means that at one point, it's fluid over time and space. At one point, there's an emphasis of private domesticity. Women are supposed to be confined in the home. So at one point, there is this emphasis of confinement. But at another, because of historical, socio-economic and political and historical processes that are taking place, the First World War, Second World War, the Depression, in the case of Zimbabwe, you have your federation and UDI and the War of Liberation.
War, yeah.
These historical developments, what they do is that they affect the manner in which the domestic ideology is deployed or negotiated.
Yeah.
Which means, if it is during the war, for example, the definition of home, all right, is revisited.
Exactly.
So where home, it meant the four corners of my house. During the war, home means the country.
Yeah.
So we are fighting for the home country. We're defending the homeland. Defending the homeland. So women's participation is now beyond those confinements, those private confinements. It's now deployed beyond the home, but within a new defined home. But what we didn't discover is that the elasticity of domesticity is that when they are deployed beyond the home, women still occupy positions, or they are still found in spaces that have home characteristics. So in the Zimbabwean case, for example, women are responsible for cooking for the troops, they're taking care of internees and refugees, that's welfare. They are in voluntary organizations, right? This is unpaid work, and unpaid, and we know housewifery is an element of domesticity, is an unpaid space.
Exactly.
So women, when they get outside the home, they are getting to the unpaid space as well, which is voluntary work. So you have women involved in so many voluntary organizations, participating in this or that. If they get into the public service, that is the labor market, women are secretaries, they're in the administrative jobs, and this is akin to the home frontier, in the sense that there's confinement, right, and there's menial and repetitive work. Exactly. So those are characteristics you also find in the home, and so the argument then is saying, look, even as women seem to be liberated and get into the public space, even as women seem to go beyond the private domestic space, they are still domesticated. They are still there. The nature of their influence, the nature of their participation in that space, within and beyond the private domestic space, still remains shaped by domesticity. Now, that takes us to another. At that point, I deliberately avoid bringing in a judgment and saying, is domesticity bad or good?
Good. Yeah. I was going to come to that.
because what we need to agree is that to a certain degree, even as we think that women are liberated, the domestic ideology is moving them. It's elastic, it's fluid, and it's changing, taking the forms of, and you may want to also suggest that there's patriarchy behind. All right. You may also want to bring in arguments or debates about the role of capital as well, how capitalism intertwines with patriarchy to deploy the domestic ideology or to navigate the domestic ideology. Now, I'll leave that and then take you to the second component of my argument before I revisit the issue of domesticity as bad or good. I'll come to that. But let me give this another aspect of my argument. I then also argue that while yes, domesticity as an ideology is elastic, it is not necessarily hegemonic. So domesticity is elastic, but it's not necessarily hegemonic. Women are not passive recipients of this ideology. They actually find ways in which they negotiate, navigate, and even redeploy domesticity. right? So you discover, for example, in that book, I have a chapter on white women and home crafts industry. So these are white women now appropriating Western domesticity and trying to export it to African women. All right? So that is part of that negotiation. So in the negotiation takes various forms. There is one way they actually confront domesticity, challenge domesticity, and there are cases where the negotiation is less confrontational. That is, we can talk about that. Should you have questions that day? But let me come back then now to the question of whether domesticity is good or bad, because that is very important. If we agree that the domestic ideology is elastic and perhaps pervasive, it's everywhere, and it's shaping the nature and extent of women's occupation, to the extent that even today, and that is the argument I make, another argument I make, that even today, the nature of our gendered relations, it would be myopic, if you want. I'm using that reservedly. It would be myopic to suggest that women's roles and status in post-colonial Zimbabwe, for example, is just a product of patriarchy. It's just a product of capital or all those things. You know, people usually see the oppression of women today as a product of patriarchy and traditional systems.
Exactly.
But what it does is to locate part of that oppression in the colonial systems, the colonial ideologies, particularly the domestic ideology, right? Which, admittedly, there's a point where Western ideology interfaces with African domestic ideology, and the product is something else. But sorry, I think I've raised 3 arguments or 4 arguments already in the book.
I can follow.
Yes. But allow me to come back to whether it is good or bad. Now, so here, the overall argument I make, I first acknowledge that there are different schools of thought. So now we have, for example, the idea of new domesticity, where there's actually a blog. I don't remember the name of the blogger, but if you Google the new housewife, the feminist housewife blog, I think you get it. Feminist housewife. It's like an oxymoron, right? Because feminists are liberated and they are going out there and exploring. The housewife is seen as someone who is confined and is in the home space, and they are meek and submissive and so forth and so forth. But the idea of the feminist housewife, this is acknowledging the idea that there are women who deliberately choose to be housewives. They actually make a choice, and the idea of feminism is feminism is about liberty, women's liberty, their independence. They are able to make a choice that brings fulfillment to them. So they are saying, look, I might choose, I might take up that feminism and make a choice to be a housewife. And enjoy being a housewife, where, of course, the do-it-yourself kind of things, phenomenon. They make their own bread, their own food, etc. They prepare stuff for their own family. They rarely buy things outside. But there's a problem with that, because it assumes a certain level of class or access to resources for you to be able to withdraw your level of power and deploy it within your home to levels of fulfillment. So that's where the problem is. But the 2 arguments are that one is that domesticity is actually oppressive, in the sense that it socializes women towards specific occupations, all right? that are home-oriented, or that are housewife-free, or that are traditionally feminine. And these traditional feminine spaces are not paying. Is paying, and it contributes to those the wage gap in a very huge way. And it confines in some other cases women to the home space because one reason or the other. And indeed, in my book, I demonstrate how this ideology actually pushes women towards the home frontier. In fact, as my research has shown, before 1950, it was embarrassing to have a working wife. It was very embarrassing because if your wife was working, it meant that she was not, as a father, you had failed, as a husband, you had failed.
You failed. Oh my God.
So you had failed your family as a husband. And because you had failed your family as a husband, it was really embarrassing that your wife is working. But come post-50s, and now as the economy is, this is where the elasticity is coming. The economy is getting slightly bad or worse. There is also increased demand after the war for labor, and it becomes embarrassing to have a wife who's not working. Who is not working. So after the 50s, it's the opposite.
It's the opposite.
If you have a wife who's not, yes, if your wife is not working, so you pick this in the sources that I use. That now a wife that is a true wife should actually be assisting the men and so forth and so forth. So that becomes. So these are shifts and changes of perspectives. But now, when this happens, where do women go? They are limited in terms of their space, in the areas where they can go. Right? They can go into masculine spaces if you want, and these are far more paying. And there are actually regulations that are in black and white that limit women's grading. So women cannot be graded to beyond a certain level. And the salaries are in black and white. It's said women must receive less salaries than men. And for the single woman, it's because the argument is that they have no one dependent on them. So what's the need the salary? But for the married woman, they have a husband to keep them. So why do they need a big? So there's actually the marriage bar. Married women get less salaries than their female counterparts, and of course, way less than their male counterparts. But what is informing this thinking is the thinking that women in the first place are supposed to be at home. So you see the domestic ideology shaping even policy, framing policy, and also framing attitudes. There is evidence that indicates that women made a choice to deliberately leave work once they got employed because they had a responsibility back home. So this is domesticity at work. So there's an argument that it limits women's opportunities. All right, it closes women's opportunities. However you look at it, because even when women have been released into the public space, they are getting into those jobs. It's called occupational crowding, occupational segregation. Women are crowded into certain types of work that are less paying, or less remunerated. They have these characteristics, warm frontier characteristics. So that is one argument. Then there's another. I don't remember the scholar, but I do discuss them in my book, where after they did a survey, they discovered that and it's almost similar to the new housewife, to the new domesticity concept. They concluded that look, in the first instance, women are different. They're different in terms of class. They're different in terms of age, in terms of capacity, all sorts. And to to homogenize the applied in the face of domesticity and conclude that it is oppressive, it is limiting, is to miss the point. We want women to speak out about their own preferences, about their own fulfillment, what they find fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
And in that research, she discovered that there are women who were not outwardly against domesticity or being housewives, but they were against specific tasks of housewifery.
Within the, okay, yeah, I see.
Is that my internet?
Yeah, there was some disturbance, but you were making a point. You can proceed.
So my apologies. So the argument is that look, it's not housewifery that women are against. It's specific tasks, and so you cannot homogenize. And say domesticity is there. And in any case, there are women who have appropriated domesticity and commercialized it. Madoiri, they've used their art, to actually produce stuff that they actually sell. And of course, there's reference to farm environments where women actually find fulfillment in a different form of domesticity on the farms and enjoy that space. And indeed, in my research book, I do come across women who actually say, look, the problem is not about being a housewife. It's not about being not working or staying at home or working in specific spaces. The issue is choice. If you are forced to, if you're if domesticity is if the ideology of domesticity is because you are a woman, that is the argument. Yeah. If it is because you are a woman, all right, and then it is imposed on you when you don't have a choice or you are against it, when you would rather be something else. So you want to be an engineer, but you end up being a secretary because that is what is available.
Exactly.
That's when it becomes a problem. But if you become a secretary because it's a choice, that's what I want, and I become a housewife because I make a choice, that's what I want, then there's why the alabalu about domesticity. Now, I have a problem with that kind of analysis. The problem is, when is choice a choice?
Mm-hmm.
What if the ideology is so powerful that it informs even a choice?
Exactly, yeah. Exactly.
Yes, such a powerful ideology is coming from socialization. I mean, the moment you are born, you drink a cup of domesticity a day, probably an hour, until you are grown up. And to an extent that what you define as a choice is really the options that have been availed to you by socialization, by the domestic ideology that is being deployed right, left, and center for you. So, but these are issues we can discuss. But basically, this is what the book does. It sort of initiates these debates, and it uses the experience of white women to sort of begin conversations around the workings of domestic ideology.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, so can you give us an outline of the literature review that you did? I'm sure that before you wrote this book, there were quite a number of written works, related material about the history of white women in Rhodesia that you may have used, or that we may say that your book contributed to that discourse. And as well, if you can also include some of the interpretations that you challenge that are found within this specific discourse.
So yeah, so I've just taken my book to refresh. So there's a book by Kate Law, which is very recent. I think it's a year or 2 years before mine. Mm-hmm. And it's also on white women in Southern Rhodesia. What she does is she looks at specifically, or largely, if you want, these women who were influential, all right? Mm-hmm. Or at least outstanding in terms of their contributions, or in terms of their, they've left a mark, a very huge mark. And it's a very inspiring book. By the time I wrote my book, yes, was just getting out, just gotten out, but I had an opportunity to also read a PhD. And so what she does in that work is to set that scene of women's experience from 1950 in Southern Rhodesia, especially political experience. And then my point of departure is then to bring in more economic and I think there are also some early works that were also done specifically on Southern Rhodesia. I remember one on settler wives. I'm trying to see if I can pick that piece quickly, but it was done in the 80s, and that piece, what it did, it was an article. What it did was to try and discuss the experiences of settler wives within Southern Rhodesia. It was Kekut, and she was writing on the incorporate. She was writing in one of the, I think it was an edited book on incorporated wives, Kekut, and she wrote a piece on settler wives in Southern Rhodesia, and another on the so-called the suitable wife. Not so much has been written. The others were not so much of scholarly works in this area. However, there have been works more broadly on white women in India, and also white women in the third world, so to speak, or in the South. In these works, what they've done is, broadly, you have works that present women as victims of colonialism, and then some that present women as villains. They were extending colonialism, or exporting colonialism, bringing civilization, so to speak. There's a lot of work that present women, talks of white women as incorporated wives. Text I've just referred you to. It's a very good, interesting text with a number of contributions. And the concept of incorporated wife really was to say women in the colonies, the definition of their being was derived from their husbands. They incorporated, right? So if your husband was an engineer and moved to this place, it moved your husband, and you probably ended up, being part and parcel of the engineering if they were teachers or whatever. So they became incorporated into the lives and lifestyle and the being of they almost lost their identity, so to speak. And in my thesis, I take up the concept of incorporation. It's part of the domestic ideology. Was in the same way that incorporate, so to speak, an animal into your home, and then it lives your lifestyle, more or less.
Exactly.
It is what you give it. So it no longer has the independence of hunting a different, its meals and so forth. So you incorporate it. So I redeploy incorporation in my book as an agent or as an aspect of the domestic ideology. So there are a couple of works that have been written broadly and recently on what is generally being called gender and imperial studies. That is the sort of class of research. There's also, lastly, very interesting stuff that, because more often than not, the research that you find on gender and imperial studies or gender and colonization, there are studies that are looking at specifically the experience of women in the colonies. But there are now works in McClintock in a very interesting piece, Imperial Leather. She's looking at gender and imperial studies in its very sense. Imperial in the sense that it also includes Britain as the locus of research in that imperial space. So it's not just the colonies, but it's also the colonies as they interact and network with metropole. And I found that fascinating, and refreshing as a piece, So yeah, and most works on women in the colonial in the colonies have been fall under what Jane Haggis has called recuperative history. Right, people are trying to recuperate, to reconstruct, to bring back women who are absent in historical processes. It's like the histories, Of course, she has problems with such kind of works because, of course, at the end of the day, you may tell a story that does not, that assumes the existence of women in the absence of other players. So it's nice to sort of have women interacting in your discussion with other processes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that response. So can you tell us about your sources? What kind of sources did you consult, and what kind of information did they provide you about white women in Rhodesia?
So I used a number of sources. First was the National Archive of Zimbabwe. So in the National Archive of Zimbabwe, I managed to get magazines, women's organizations. Those were, very fascinating. I particularly love and will always remember the National Housewife Register and these magazines. Not fancy, but I really loved it because this was like an association of housewives in the magazine. You can imagine the kind of discussion we're having, and it fascinated me that these housewives were determined to sort of liberate themselves, getting themselves educated and so forth. And when they got themselves educated, they went to work and system housewives. And then the National Housewife Register, lost their relevance. So it was like a big eating itself. I love that magazine. Then there were minutes of meetings. The correspondence with the state, with the government, the conferences that they had, and these were documented and so forth. So in the National Archives. I was also fortunate to access private papers. So private papers from Muro Rosin works, and I've done a piece on Muro. now I might mix up the names there. Let me not bring them in, but one of them is Muro Rosie. And then access to diaries from 1909. I didn't use them much in my thesis in the book, but access to diaries, I went through those diaries from a farm. They're staying on a farm from 1909 to 1925. But I say something about those diaries. In fact, the good thing about diaries is that, of course, there's self-censorship, right? But they speak freely about experiences and they pick some of the things. The personal, information or personal archives, they sort of counter the state archive, because the state archive is constructed by a patriarchal state, male-dominated state. So in terms of its silences, there's a lot that is silent in the archive in terms of gendered histories or gendered discussions. So more often than not, it's reading between lines. And ironically, the archive, in terms of its establishment, I actually saw a statement from one of the minutes of a women's meeting, the Federation of Women Institutes, where they were recommending that the government establish a national archive. So the women are actually part of that process of recommending for a national archive. But the big construction of that archive, the stuff that is deposited and so forth, is largely representative of the patriarchal and male-dominated nature of the state, and it's a state archive. I was also fortunate to access the Rhodes House archives in UK.
Wonderful.
Where I accessed, where I accessed the letters by Staunton, Miriam Staunton. She was a very influential woman. She was a white woman who, together with Mangwente, now I don't remember her first name, but I think she was wife to Chief Mangwende, and I don't know her first name. They were the first to actually establish these home crafts for African women, the women's clubs, right? So she wrote letters to a brother, to a father, to a mother, from around 1969 to around, from around 19, in the early 60s, I think. I don't remember very well. Around 71, 72. I think from around 64 or 63, thereabout, or 62 even. And she was writing almost every week to either of the three, or to all, sometimes to two of the three. She was writing every week, writing them about her experience. And you see the changes, even of an impression, upon arrival, when she's describing the African women as raw themselves in the early 60s. And then in the 70s, she's affectionately describing them as, my people, my friends. They are affectionate about me. They call me Ushehwedu. They are bringing chicken to here, so forth, etc. And then they have this camaraderie, if you want. She grows very fond of them. So in those letters, you can see these shifts, these changes in terms of the relations and the perceptions. But you can also tell a story about your own life. The movements that she has to make, because the husband has to move. I think he's a local administrator, and I think a native administrator, as they were called. And so you also have a feel of your own life as a housewife. And this is totally that. people.
Right. I think we had lost connection there. But you can proceed. You can proceed.
Yes. So yes. So it was very interesting. I had interviews one-on-one with white women and some white men, and got to. But it's interesting that in the interviews, the women tended to speak to downplay their roles.
Mm.
They always say, "No, it's just a housewife." And, I think there's nothing that may interest you. And I was like, it's precisely what I want to
What I want
get
to,
to.
what you're looking for.
Yes. And they'll say, no, look, I can tell you about my father. He was actually this and that. And of course, this is what I was trying to break. Where women were relegated to the domestic space, which was considered irrelevant or not as important. And up to this day, that space is not valorized. All right?
Mm.
This is why there are campaigns for housewives to even pay, something like that. Because they're not valorized. When you do the same job that the housewife is doing and you do it elsewhere, you pay. You pay them. You pay for your food when you go outside to eat. So there are all those debates. But I could pick those things, and it was interesting where people would, then after some discussions and explanations, then they will begin to open up and tell me more about their lives as housewives or even as workers. And I had access to interviews, that pre-recorded interviews, and you would also see the same thing. In these pre-recorded interviews, women preferring to speak about their brothers or their fathers and the victories and exciting stories that they exciting histories and experience that they had, and less about themselves. So you could pick those in the interviews. So those were by and large the kind of sources that I work with.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Dr. Ushehwedu, thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much for giving time to have a discussion with me about your book. I believe that this will be of fundamental importance to our student community and to the ordinary person who is interested in reading and listening to stuff like this. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Bye.